Book summary: Man's search for meaning and the brutality beneath its philosophy. The danger with man's search for meaning is that people remember the wisdom and forget the world that produced it. They remember the lines about meaning, attitude, and inner freedom. They forget the beatings, the starvation, the filth, the selection ramps, the frost, the exhaustion, the dead bodies, and the daily reduction of human beings to laboring matter. Frankl's book is not built on abstract suffering. Organized violence within the Nazi camp system forms the foundation of Frankl's book, and the force of his later philosophy relies on a clear confrontation with that reality. Frankl was deported in 1942 to Theresienstadt with his family, later transported onward through Auschwitz, and survived other camps in the Dachau system. While his father died in Theresienstadt, his mother was murdered after transport to Auschwitz, and his wife died in Bergen-Belsen. That matters because the book can be misread as a calm work of uplift. It is not. The first part is an account of camp life under conditions of hunger, degradation, terror, and emotional numbness. Beacon's guide to the book explicitly frames this section around the prisoner's psychological progression through shock, apathy, and the strange, morally disorienting aftermath of liberation. Frankl is not saying suffering is beautiful. He is describing what happens when a human being is forced to live in a machine built to break body, personality, and hope. The world before everything changes. Before the camps, Frankl had a life with shape. He was a trained psychiatrist in Vienna, intellectually ambitious, already developing the ideas that would later become logotherapy. He had work, status, a marriage, and an unfinished manuscript. Britannica notes that he studied medicine, developed an early professional reputation, and had already begun thinking about the problem of meaning before deportation. That earlier stability gives the later collapse its force. Frankl is not writing as a man who began with nothing and lost nothing. He is writing as someone who watched a recognizable human life be dismantled step by step. The Nazis did not merely place him in danger. They stripped away profession, privacy, family structure, ordinary time, and the social confirmation that a person is still a person. The world before the camps is important because it shows how much had to be destroyed before the later question even becomes possible: what remains when nearly everything outward has been taken? The first break in the pattern. The first break is deportation, but in Frankl's telling, the real rupture deepens on arrival in the camps. The prisoner enters a system in which violence is normal, arbitrariness is law, and physical survival is never secure. One of the most infamous details in the memoir is the immediate confiscation of what he tried to save, including the manuscript he had carried with him. That loss is not just personal disappointment. It is symbolic of the camp's purpose, to erase continuity between the life you had and the object you are being turned into. Beacon's guide describes this opening stage as one of shock, where the prisoner is thrust into a world whose logic is humiliation and uncertainty. The violence here is not only spectacular violence, it is administrative violence, repetitive violence, and ordinary violence. It is being struck for moving too slowly or merely being in the way. It is the constant threat of kicks, blows, shouting, punishment, and selection. It is chronic hunger so severe that food becomes an obsession, and moral life starts to warp around crumbs, soup, bread, and the chance of conserving strength for one more day. It is the body being exposed to cold, dirt, lice, disease, and hard labor until pain becomes less an event than an atmosphere. Frankl's account is powerful precisely because he does not need to inflate this reality. The system is already monstrous without rhetorical decoration. And once that break comes, there is no clean line back to the old world. The prisoner learns fast that the old rules no longer apply. Dignity can be mocked. Death can be casual. Survival can depend on luck, timing, health, concealment, and whether a guard or capo happens to notice you at the wrong moment. The people who carry the story. Frankl is the center of the book, but he matters less as a heroic personality than as a consciousness under pressure. He is starving, frightened, bereaved, physically vulnerable, and yet still trying to observe what happens to the human mind inside systematic cruelty. That doubleness is what makes him compelling. He is both witness and specimen. He studies camp psychology while being mangled by it. The surrounding figures are not developed like characters in a novel, but they become unforgettable because each one reveals a different human adaptation to violence. Some prisoners become coarse, selfish, or emotionally deadened. Some retain scraps of tenderness. Some are sustained by religion, memory, future plans, or attachment to loved ones. Others collapse into despair when the future they were living toward disappears. Frankl's account is harsh on this point. Camp life did not simply reveal saints and villains. It placed people under conditions so brutal that scruple itself became hard to preserve. The study guide literature around the book often returns to Frankl's grim observation that survival could involve moral compromise, and that the best of us did not return is not triumphal language, but tragic recognition. His wife is one of the book's most important presences, even though she is largely absent in literal scene terms. In the camps, Frankl's inward relation to her becomes one of the ways he resists total inner collapse. That is why the book's reflections on love hit so hard. They do not come from comfort. They come from a place where the beloved may already be dead, and the mind still reaches toward her anyway. Love, in this book, is not sentiment. It is one of the last forms of human orientation left standing. How the story unfolds. The camp memoir unfolds as a record of reduction. Each day strips life down further. Frankl describes men waking into freezing mornings, going out to labor on almost nothing to eat, watching the sick weaken, the exhausted stumble, the dead accumulate, and the living become numb enough to step around suffering because there is no reserve left to answer every cry. Hunger narrows imagination. Sleep deprivation distorts thought. Fear becomes ordinary. The body ceases to feel like a possession and becomes a burden that must somehow be dragged through another day. Violence in the book works on several levels at once. There is overt physical violence, beatings, kicks, shoves, threats, and the arbitrary exercise of power by guards and prisoner functionaries. There is environmental violence, cold, overcrowding, inadequate clothing, disease, poor sanitation, and exhausting labor. And there is psychological violence, uncertainty about loved ones, constant exposure to death, the loss of individuality, the terror of selection, and the slow corrosion of feeling through apathy. Frankl's description of apathy is one of the memoir's central insights. It is not presented as cowardice. It is a defensive deadening, a psychic crust that forms when unrelieved pain and horror become too continuous to meet with full feeling every hour. This is why the book's moments of beauty matter so much. A sunset, a remembered face, a joke, a scientific thought, an imagined future lecture, and a few spoken words between prisoners. These moments do not erase suffering. They interrupt total domination. They are tiny acts of inward non-cooperation. Frankl's later philosophy grows directly out of this. Meaning is not a decorative lesson added after the fact. It is presented as one of the few forces that can keep psychic disintegration from becoming complete. The scene, chapter, or turn that changes everything. The decisive turn in the book is not the end of the war. It is the realization, repeated under impossible conditions, that a human being may still retain some final freedom of stance even inside a system of near-total external control. This is the most quoted idea in the book, and also the one most likely to be softened into motivational language. Read in context, it is much harder than that. Frankl is making the claim from inside hunger, cold, threat, labor, grief, and constant degradation. He is not denying the reality of coercion. He is isolating the last inner margin that coercion does not fully own. What makes this turn so powerful is that it emerges against a background of relentless bodily suffering. The prisoners are not choosing attitudes from comfort. They are trying to preserve some fragment of inward authorship while living among blows, insults, fear, emaciation, and death. Frankl repeatedly shows how easy it is for the person to be reduced to animal immediacy under such conditions. Food fantasies dominate conversation. Physical weakness shapes moral decisions. The sick and exhausted drift toward the edge. The camp system works precisely because it attacks body and mind together. So when Frankl argues that meaning can still be found through work, love, and the attitude taken toward unavoidable suffering, the point lands because the alternative is visible everywhere around him: psychic collapse, despair, cynicism, brutality, or surrender to emptiness. The Viktor Frankl Institute still summarizes those three pathways to meaning as central to logotherapy. But in the memoir, they are not presented like neat categories in a lecture hall. They are survival resources tested inside an environment of radical dehumanization. That is the moment that changes everything. The book stops being only a witness statement and becomes an argument about the human person under extremity, not a comforting argument, a severe one. Frankl does not say suffering is good. He says that when suffering cannot be avoided, the question becomes whether it will remain meaningless, the ending, and what it resolves. Liberation does not arrive in the book as a clean emotional release. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's account of liberation specifically quotes Frankl on the numb, almost disbelieving reaction survivors could feel when freedom finally came. That matches one of the memoir's most important truths. People do not walk out of hell and become whole on cue. They walk out altered, confused, often unable to feel what they expected to feel. Frankl is explicit that liberation carries bitterness and depersonalization as well as relief. The body may be free, but the psyche has been trained by terror. Worse still, liberation often brings confirmation that the people one lived inwardly toward are dead. For Frankl, that meant learning that his wife, mother, and brother had all been lost. Survival, then, is not narrative victory. It is continuation after devastation. What the ending resolves is not grief or history. It resolves the book's central intellectual struggle. Frankl emerges with the conviction that life still possesses meaning under every condition, though never in a simplistic or sentimental way. The camps are not redeemed. The suffering is not justified. But the human response is not reduced to nothing. That distinction is the book's final achievement. What the story is really about, at its deepest level, man's search for meaning is about what systematic cruelty tries to erase. It is about the destruction of dignity and the refusal to let dignity be fully destroyed. It is about the body under assault, the mind under siege, and the last inner claims of love, memory, conscience, and responsibility. Frankl's philosophy is inseparable from camp violence because it is a response to a setting in which the human person was intentionally treated as disposable matter. The book is also about the psychological mechanics of suffering. Frankl does not present pain as noble. He shows how pain can degrade, narrow, brutalize, and empty a person out. Hunger can make the spiritual life look absurd. Exhaustion can flatten tenderness. Repeated violence can make apathy feel like the only available shield. That honesty is one reason the book still carries weight. It does not lie about what suffering does. It asks whether suffering must therefore be the whole truth about a person. And that is where its deepest seriousness lies. Frankl's answer is that meaning is not a mood, not a slogan, and not a denial of horror. It is an orientation toward responsibility even when life has become almost unlivable. That is a much harsher message than modern self-help usually offers, which is also why it has lasted, why it endures. The book endures because it does two things at once. It preserves a witness to a historically specific form of evil, and it offers a language many readers carry into their own lesser but still serious forms of suffering. Beacon Press says the book has sold more than 16 million copies and been translated into more than 50 languages. Those numbers do not prove greatness by themselves, but they do show unusual reach for a work grounded in Holocaust testimony and existential psychology. It also endures because it is harder than it first appears. Stripped down, Frankl's claim is not stay positive. It is closer to this. Even when circumstances become degrading, violent, and absurd, life still confronts you with responsibility. That idea has force because it was not written from a safe chair. It was written by someone who had seen the body humiliated, the dead piled up, the mind flatten into apathy, and hope become both necessary and dangerous. That is why the book still lands. It never lets the reader forget that its philosophy was purchased at terrible human cost, and it never lets suffering have the final word.